Last time I taught, throughout this quarterly, we've been going through several stories of the Old Testament, the different military campaigns that occurred after Israel had moved into the Promised Land, and now we're getting close to the time that the Babylonians will come in and take them off into captivity. But last time we talked about Jonathan attacking that Philistine outpost, and we talked about how Jonathan had one of only 2 swords in all the land of Israel, and used that as an example of how sometimes those that are strong in the faith, as Paul tells us, have to stand in the gap for those that are weaker to bear their burdens. And today, though, we find the exact opposite of that scenario that I also discussed last time. Sometimes the best plan of action is to stand still and watch God do all the work. And that's what we will find today in 2 Corinthians chapter 32. Chronicles. I always get those mixed up. 2 Chronicles chapter 32. Chronicles is in the Old Testament, Corinthians is in the New Testament. Today's lesson deals with a guy named Hezekiah, who you have no doubt heard of. He is the king of the southern kingdom of Judah. We know that Israel was unified under King David, under Saul and King David, so that you had all the 12 tribes in one country. But by the time David's grandson Rehoboam comes to the throne, there's a civil war in Israel, and you have the 10 northern tribes, and then you have the 2 southern tribes of Judah. So Hezekiah is the king of Judah. And he's most famous for that story that you've no doubt heard about how God told him he was going to die, and he prayed, and God spared his life, but he wanted some proof, so God turned the sun back for him to prove that he was going to spare his life. That's probably what Hezekiah is most known for. But he's a major character in the history of Israel, and you can read about him in the book of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. He makes up a large portion of the earlier part of the book of Isaiah, because Isaiah served as Hezekiah's prophet. But here in the early part of his rule as king, he rebels against the Assyrian Empire, which was at that time the most powerful country on the face of the earth. They were the biggest empire, had the biggest army, the most feared empire on the face of the earth. And Hezekiah's dad, Ahaz, had entered into this arrangement with Assyria. Kind of like a mob boss goes around and makes people pay him protection so they don't come in and wreck the joint. That's kind of what he did with the Assyrian Empire. He entered into this agreement where he said, basically, we're going to give you some money, we're going to pay you some tribute if you leave us alone and let us attend to our own matters here internally. You leave us alone and we'll give you a lot of money and not cause any trouble. That was what Hezekiah's father Ahaz had worked out with the Assyrians. Well, Hezekiah says, no, we ain't doing that anymore, which obviously does not sit well with the king of Assyria, because, again, kind of like a mob boss, if you have one person say, we're not going to pay you the protection money anymore, if you let that slide, your empire is going to crumble apart pretty fast. If you let one person stand up against you, everybody else is going to say, well, hey, we don't have to do this either. Yeah. So the Assyrians march into Judah, and they overtake much of the country and place those regions under the control of neighboring states, and then they come to Jerusalem, which is where we find ourselves this morning. So Hezekiah and his army fortify the city. Jerusalem already had walls all around it, but they fortified the walls even more. They even took care of one of Jerusalem's major tactical disadvantages. See, all the fresh water that flowed into Jerusalem came from this spring called Gihon, but it was located outside the walls of the city, which causes a problem if you're engaging in the kind of warfare they were engaging in, because what would happen is an army would approach one of these walled cities, and rather than trying to break in, because your enemy, if they're behind the walls, has the advantage, you've got to either get a siege ramp and go over the walls or knock down the door. What they do is they just camp out around the outside of the city and wait them out. Because if you block in all the imports and exports, eventually you're going to starve them out. Or you see that quite often in ancient warfare like this. Well, so Gihon, their source of fresh water, was outside the gates of the city. And if the Assyrians came, they could just cut the water off, and in a matter of days, Jerusalem would fall, because you can't do a whole lot without water. But Hezekiah and this is just a bonus. This ain't where we're going, but you can dwell on this. Hezekiah and his army figured out a way around this. They blocked off the spring on the outside of the walls and dug them a tunnel to reroute the water inside the walls. And the tunnel was called the Tunnel of Siloam, and it ended up in a pool called the Pool of Siloam. And you can read about the Pool of Siloam in the book of John, because when Jesus heals a blind man, he says, now go wash in the Pool of Siloam. Still there. That's something to think about. That's something to study on. We might come back to that a later time, but I don't want to... God made provision all those years before for that blind man to be healed. Yeah. So we'll come back to that some other time. That's not where we're going this morning. But so they make all these preparations before the Assyrians arrive at their doors. Hezekiah rallies the troops, and he gives them this speech. If you look in 2 Chronicles 32, verse 7, it says, be strong and courageous. Be not afraid nor dismayed for the king of Assyria, nor for all the multitude that is with him, for there be more with us than with him. And they, again, had the largest, most powerful army on the face of the earth. What in the world would Hezekiah be talking about, that there's more with us than with him? He says, with him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight, pay attention to this, to fight our battles. And the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. And the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. But the emperor of Assyria wasn't going down without a fight. His name was Sennacherib. He wasn't going down without a fight. He had to make an example of these rebellious Hebrews here that refused to pay their tribute to the empire. So here's what he does, though. Like I said, if you just try to march an army into a walled city, you're already at a disadvantage. They have the home court advantage. So, and Hezekiah had already taken care to reroute the water from outside, so they were kind of set up inside the walls of Jerusalem. They were good for a while. So the typical tactic of just cutting them off and laying siege to them and waiting them out, that wasn't going to work. So Sennacherib tries something different. He tries something different. Without one shot fired or one sword drawn, he engages in what a modern military would call psychological warfare. That's what they call it. This made me think, in the days before the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, U.S. bombers flew over Japan and dropped leaflets saying, basically, we have the most powerful weapon on the face of the earth. If you don't evacuate your cities, we're going to turn it to ruin. And we're doing this because your government hasn't surrendered to the Allied forces yet. If something doesn't happen, destruction is going to come to your city. It was psychological warfare. It sounds like you're giving them fair warning, but really what it's trying to do is sow seeds of dissent among the ranks. It's supposed to scare people and intimidate people, and the idea is that you can divide the enemy army enough that you don't actually have to fight. They'll just get so scared of what you're saying that they'll lay down their arms. And that's exactly what Sennacherib is trying to do here. This isn't, for whatever reason, printed in your quarterly. I'm just going to go ahead and read it, though. It's in 2 Chronicles. Listen what he says. He rolls up to the walls of Jerusalem, and he says, whereon do ye trust? He's hollering this at the people inside the city. That ye abide in the siege in Jerusalem. Doth not Hezekiah persuade you to give yourself over to die by famine and by thirst, saying, the Lord our God shall deliver us out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Now this is the king of Assyria talking. Hath not the same Hezekiah taken away his high places and his altars, and commanded Judah and Jerusalem, saying, Ye shall worship before one altar, and burn incense upon it. Know ye not what I and my fathers have done unto all the people of other lands? Were the gods of the nations of those lands anyways able to deliver their lands out of my hand? Who was there among all the gods of those nations that my fathers utterly destroyed, that could deliver his people out of my hand? That your God should be able to deliver you out of my hand. Now, therefore, let not Hezekiah deceive you, nor persuade you on this manner, neither yet believe him. For no God of any nation or kingdom was able to deliver his people out of my hand. How much less shall your God deliver you out of my hand? So he's engaging in psychological warfare. He's trying to sow seeds of dissension among the ranks. He's trying to scare them into just giving up before the battle's even been fought. But remember what Chronicles said. The people rested on the words of Hezekiah. Now here's the thing though. Sennacherib, this is I think why it didn't have the effect that he intended. Sennacherib had a fundamental misunderstanding about what Hezekiah had been doing in Israel. When Hezekiah came to power, the kings that had reigned before him had allowed these things called high places to exist in the land of Israel. These were regional temples and shrines that people had erected. Now, sometimes they worshiped the God of Israel at these shrines. Sometimes they worshiped idols. You can read, I think it's in 2 Kings. They still had that bronze serpent that Moses had erected out in the wilderness when all the people got bit by snakes. They still had that hanging out at one of these shrines, and they were worshiping it as its own God. Well, Hezekiah comes in. See, in Deuteronomy, God had told the people, unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes, to put his name there. Even unto his habitation shall ye speak, and thither shalt thou come. What he's saying is God told him way back in Deuteronomy that I'm going to pick out a place where my name will be worshipped. And that is where you're going to come and do it. We're not going to have temples all over the land of Israel. We're not going to have shrines all over the land of Israel. Solomon built God a temple. God's Spirit dwelt there. And that is where people were expected to worship the God of Israel. And yet these kings had allowed, even Solomon had allowed all these high places to exist. But when Hezekiah came in, he tore them all down. He was trying to be faithful to the Word of God. He tore them all down and he said, we're going to worship God where God's Spirit dwells. Right. But see, Sennacherib didn't know any of that. In his mind, in his pagan mind frame, he thought that any God who would allow, see, God, in their mind, the events of this world reflected the strength or weakness of the gods that those people served. So in his mind, he's thinking that this young whippersnapper Hezekiah comes to the throne and starts to tear down all these temples to Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. How powerful could Yahweh really be if he just allowed some young king to tear down all these shrines? He didn't know all that history about God wanting to be worshipped in one place and one place only. What Sennacherib sees as unfaithfulness is actually evidence of Hezekiah's devotion to the God of Israel. But here's an interesting thing. No one ever points out Sennacherib's error. Nobody hollers back across the wall and says, you dummy, you don't know nothing. Like, God wanted us to tear down all those high places. Nobody says anything. Look at, you don't have to turn there, I'll read it to you. 2 Kings 18 and 36. It says, the people held their peace and answered him not a word. For the king's commandment, Hezekiah's commandment was, saying, answer him not. And 2 Chronicles said what? The people rested on the words of Hezekiah, the king of Judah. They were in the right. They were doing what God had commanded. Sennacherib was completely off base, but they didn't even dignify that attempt at sowing doubt. They didn't even dignify it with a response. Right. They held their peace. Instead, Hezekiah goes to prayer. He goes to prayer. I think I've lost it. Here we go. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32, again, this isn't listed in your quarterly, but it says in verse 20, "For this cause Hezekiah the king and the prophet Isaiah the son of Amos prayed and cried to heaven." Prayed and cried to heaven. Now in 2 Kings, it tells us what he said. He said, let me find it here, I'm flipping a lot. Hezekiah, wait, that's not it. Chapter 19, I'm 18, that's why. Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, "O Lord God of Israel, which dwelleth between the cherubims, thou art the God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Thou hast made heaven and earth. Lord, bow down thine ear and hear. Open, Lord, thine eyes and see, and hear the words of Sennacherib, which hath sent him to reproach the living God. Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have destroyed the nations and their lands, and have cast down their gods into the fire. For they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they have destroyed them. Now therefore, O Lord our God, I beseech thee, save thou us out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord God, even thou only." So he goes to prayer, and God heard Hezekiah's prayer, and he answered Hezekiah through the words of Isaiah. And Isaiah has a long condemnation here of Sennacherib, but listen what he says. Listen to the message Isaiah is sending out to the king of Assyria through God. God says, "I know thy abode," talking to Sennacherib. "I know where you live. I know thy going out and thy coming in, and thy rage against me. Because thy rage against me and thy tumult has come up into mine ears, therefore I will put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips," talking about him like a work animal, "and I will turn thee back by the way by which thou camest." Now that's pretty bold words for the most powerful military on the face of the earth, who have surrounded a tiny little city with just the people inside of it. But God says, "I'm going to send you back the way you came." So without a word exchanged between Judah and their enemy, without a sword drawn or an arrow shot, we find that God gave Judah, Jerusalem, the victory. 2 Chronicles, you see this, well, nope, that's not your quarterly either. Why did they leave all this stuff out? It's good. The Lord sent an angel, it says in verse 21 of Chronicles 32. The Lord sent an angel which cut off all the mighty men of valor and the leaders and captains in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned with shame of face to his own land. And it says later he was come into the house of his God. They that came forth of his own bowels slew him there with the sword. And history tells us that Sennacherib was killed by one of his own sons later. And his son took the throne. But it just says that the Lord sent an angel to cut him off. 2 Kings gives us a little more detail. It says, "It came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses." Judah didn't have to raise one sword. They didn't have to engage in one bit of warfare. The angel of the Lord went into the camp of the Assyrians and just smote them all dead. The Bible remains unclear what happened, but Greek sources from the same time have this legend that says that night mice came into the camp of the Assyrians and chewed off all the strings on their bows and the handles on their shields. Modern historians argue that that's a fable, and what actually happened was a disease outbreak just happened out of nowhere in the camp of the Assyrians. Either way, God sent divine protection through his angel of the Lord, sent divine victory, and Israel didn't have to do anything. Judah didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to fight one battle. All they had to do was cry to God like Hezekiah did. Remember what Hezekiah had told him from the beginning. With us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles.
Right.
And because the people rested on the words of Hezekiah, that is exactly what happened.
Right.
God fought the battle, and they didn't have to. Now, this is the problem I have with this quarterly. What are we supposed to take from this as Christians? Because we're not, organizing military campaigns with walled cities against international empires. I mean, we're not fighting physical wars. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. So I had a difficult time as I studied this lesson, but I kept coming back to 2 Kings chapter 18 and 36, where it says the people held their peace and answered him not a word. For the king's commandment was, answer him not. And I thought about verse 8 of 2 Chronicles chapter 32, where it said the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah, king of
Good stuff
Judah.
right there. Good information.
This, I'm not talking to anybody but myself, but I so often feel compelled that I have to open my mouth about everything. Social media has been the worst possible thing for me, because by its very design, the way those apps are designed, it encourages me to always have an opinion about everything. To always be offering my thoughts and my comments about everything, no matter how informed I am or not. It's engineered that way. They have set it up that way. You get reaction and you get feedback. It's addictive. It's addictive. They have designed these things to be addictive. And yet, here we have Hezekiah. I thought maybe I'm the only one that this resonates with, but I thought about Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem sitting within the walls and listening to all the things that the Assyrians were saying to him about how their fathers had come and had torn down every god that they had come up against, had reduced the idols to rubble, had utterly decimated every other god that stood up in front of them. And they were going to do the same thing to Israel. And no doubt, like I said, they were operating under a false assumption about the God of Israel. And no doubt they probably thought, I want to say something. He's wrong. I want to tell him, maybe he doesn't know about that time that our God wiped through the land of Egypt and killed every firstborn, and then split the Red Sea wide open and drowned the entire army of the Egyptians, which was the most powerful army on the face of the earth at that time. Maybe Sennacherib hasn't heard the stories about how God delivered the promised land into our hands, how Jericho, that mighty walled city, all we had to do was walk around it and blow some. I kind of want to tell him, I kind of want to comment, I kind of want to retweet it. They've got a Facebook troll standing outside the gates of the city going your God is just as weak as every other God. I'm going to reduce you to rubble. In Chronicles, it says, this siege is going to go so badly for you. This is gross, but it says this in the Bible. You're going to be eating your own feces and drinking your own urine before this is over. I mean, they're standing outside the walls hollering this stuff. And there was a Zack Harold inside the walls going I want to say something. But the people kept their peace. The people held their peace because they rested in the words of Hezekiah, who had told them that the Lord our God is going to fight our battles for us. We have him on our side. Sennacherib has an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us to fight our battles. They held their peace because they rested on the promise that Hezekiah, the king of Judah, had made to them. Now that's unprecedented. You're supposed to fight fire with fire, right? But no, because they rested on God's words, because they placed their trust in God and God alone, they won a battle against the most fearsome empire on the earth at the face of that time and didn't have to do anything at all. it made me think of something. As some of you know, I've been doing Bible classes with that congregation in Bangladesh for the last several months. And one of the first things that the pastor there asked me he gave me a list of things that he wanted me to speak on when we first started. And one of the ones that I had been putting off because I frankly felt unqualified to teach about it was Christian living. And who am I to tell anybody about Christian living? I feel like I failed the cause of Christ so much, but when it came time for that lesson, I thought, well, where else do you go but to the words of Jesus? And where else can you begin but with the Sermon on the Mount? And I taught him about how Jesus said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's called we learned about that in like 5th grade social studies. It's called the Code of Hammurabi. It's the oldest written law code on the face of the earth. Jesus said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that you resist not evil, for whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law and take away your coat, let him have your cloak also. And whoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him too. And I certainly have been guilty of reading those words of Jesus and thinking, well, Jesus, that's kind of naive, isn't it? Isn't it? I mean, like, yeah, Jesus, that would be nice if the world really worked like that. But like, that's not really how the world works, Jesus. I'm sorry. But as I was preparing my lesson for the Bangladesh church, the Spirit smacked me upside the head. Jesus knows everything, so he knew exactly how difficult it would be to turn the other cheek and to go 2 miles with a soldier that compels you to go 1 mile. And if somebody sues you and takes your coat, how difficult it would be to also give them your shirt. He understands how difficult it would be, and yet he commands us to do it because it is the most radical possible response to the workings of this world. If you repay violence with violence, you just continue the cycle of violence. An eye for an eye, that old saying says, makes the whole world blind. Instead, what Jesus is instructing his followers to do here is to disarm the power of the enemy, to disarm the power of violence, to disarm the workings of this world, to stop it dead in its tracks with you. It stops here. The smiting on the cheek stops here. The violence stops here. The evil stops here. This is not a passive response. This is not becoming somebody's doormat. This is not displaying weakness. Jesus' instructions to us, on the contrary, say, I will sacrifice my pride, my desire for revenge, my need to be right all the time, in an effort to disarm the workings of the enemy. That's exactly what Hezekiah and they're not engaging with what he's bringing to their gates. They're putting an end to it by staying silent. They aren't responding. They're letting God take care of the problem. They're not playing the Assyrians' game. They say, no, we're doing something completely different than what you're trying to do. We're just going to stay silent and let God handle it. Jesus says to Pilate when he's taken before Pilate before his crucifixion, almost exactly what Isaiah said to Sennacherib.
Good example.
You wouldn't have any power to do anything to me unless it was given to you from above. God told the king of the Assyrians, I know you're rising up. I know you're sitting down. If you go back and read, God said, I knew that you were going to overtake all those other countries. Yeah. I knew you were going to do all that stuff. But it stops right here. He disarmed Jesus by not, he said, if my kingdom were of this world, then would my followers fight, but my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus disarms in the same way that Hezekiah and his army here are thwarting the forces of the most powerful military on earth. Pilate was a representative of Rome, the most powerful government on earth at that time. But Jesus, by sacrificing himself, by allowing himself to go to the cross, he said, no man takes my life from me, but I lay it down freely. Jesus is disarming the power of the enemy. He is thwarting the power of the enemy, is disarming violence and evil and revenge with the power of self-sacrificial love, and calls us to do the same. Again, I'm talking to myself as much as anybody. It is so tempting, and I fall prey to it so many times, that when somebody comes against you, and you know you're right, I kind of want to say something. Like, I kind of want to open my mouth. But no, if somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn and show them the other. If somebody conscripts you to go 2 miles, that example was in those days a Roman soldier could pick any citizen they wanted and put their heavy backpack on them and say, okay, buddy, you're going 1 mile with me. Jesus says if that happens, go 2. If somebody sues you and takes your coat away, just say, all right, well, here, you probably need my shirt too. Go ahead and take that. That is the Christian response to the workings of this world. Not revenge, not repaying evil with evil, but stopping it right in its place. You've come this far, but shall go no further. And even if it means my ego has to get bruised, in the meantime, even if it means my body has to get bruised, it stops right here. Hezekiah had the high ground. He had every right to open his mouth and preach back at Sennacherib and tell him how big his God was, and tell him how wrong he was, and tell him exactly what his misunderstanding of Jewish theology was, and how his God, oh buddy, your fathers might have overrun all those other gods of the Israel, but my God made the heavens and the earth. My God split the Red Sea so we could walk over it. He split the Jordan River, so he delivered this land into our hands, and the fathers of David. We put the Philistines to running. Gideon with 300 men sent an army the opposite way. They all killed each other just because the Spirit of God went. He could have opened his mouth and he could have said all those things. He had God on his side, but he didn't open his mouth. None of the other people did either, because they had the promise that God was with them and that God would fight their battles, and they rested on that promise. Yeah. And I want you to notice what happened after Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem had won that battle. Thus the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib and the king of Assyria, and from the hand of all others, and guided them on every side. And many brought gifts unto the Lord to Jerusalem, and presents to Hezekiah king of Judah, so that he was magnified in the sight of all nations from thenceforth. Now that wasn't what Hezekiah prayed when he prayed to God. He didn't say, God, fight this battle so everybody will see how right I am. Hezekiah prayed to God. He said, God, deliver us so that they will realize that you are not like the gods of the nations. That you're not just a God made of wood and stone, but God, you're the God that made the heavens, that you are the only God. Hezekiah's prayer when he was up against all that opposition was not that God show everybody how right that I am. It was God show everybody how good you are. And by winning that victory, by putting their trust in God, it said many brought gifts unto the Lord of Jerusalem. People started coming from all over saying, I don't know anything about this God of the Israelites, but if he could put the Assyrians to flight, there must be something about it. Yeah. Same thing happens when we, again, talking about Christian living. This is what I told the church there in Bangladesh. The thing about this is, when you start living that way, like the world has lots of things to offer, but one thing that is in incredibly short supply outside the walls of the church, and I don't mean that as like the walls of this church, but outside the bounds of the Christian community, two things that you don't find very often in the world is love and forgiveness.
Amen.
But we have storehouses of it, an unending supply. So like when Hezekiah wins the victory over Assyria and those people take notice and start to give glory to the God of Israel, when we act the way Jesus does and share that love and forgiveness that we've been given in droves, people take notice of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, and say, man, there is something different about what's going on within the walls of Jerusalem. And Hezekiah was magnified in the sight of all nations from thenceforth. What did Jesus say? If I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. And that's our job, is to lift not ourselves, but him up. Thank you for your attention.